Hello and welcome to the final panel of this long day. After the panel, we are supposed to have a roundtable discussion, but I'll make every effort to convince Hani that we should postpone this to tomorrow. Maybe we can have a better productive day, if you would like. Let's see. Fingers crossed. So we have 4 speakers in our last panel. We will start with Ines Khenza from American University of Beirut. And then we will continue with Faryal, University of Cambridge. And then we will have Chiara Fontana, University of Rome. And then our last speaker will be Claire Savina, Paris Sorbonne, University of Oxford. Ines, please.
Okay. Thank you, Hani, for putting together this really fascinating conference. And it's my first semester at AUB. I'm very happy and honored that all of you could come all the way here, and very happy to be part of this. In the Naker on Delegation, a book entitled Al-Jumana fil Wufud, which is the 4th book in the encyclopedic Adab anthology of Al-Aqd, the necklace, produced in Cordoba during the 4th century as Al-Andalus was transitioning from an emirate to a caliphate. Ibn Abd Rabbihi, the compiler and author, narrates an anecdote about the celebrated Manadira leader, An-Nu'man, visiting the king of the Persians, Kisra, in which this exchange happens. Okay. Thinking of all the delegations, Kitab al-Wufud delegations, so thinking of all the delegations that come to the palace of Kisra, he was kind of comparing them. And he tells An-Nu'man, I've been thinking about Amr al-Arab and the other Wufud al-Umam. And he lists all the wufud, all the at the time, and finds that each ummah had its own prestige. So Rome, they had their fame and ulfa wa bunyan. Al-Hind was very famous for bilad anhara wa bilada wa thimara wal hikma wa tib. And he goes on until he gets to the Arabs, and he says, which is the last line here, وَلَمْ أَرَى لِلْعَرَبِ شَيْئًا مِنْ خِصَالِ الْخَيْرِ. So Arabs did not kind of convince him in any way, especially compared to the other Ummam. Well, An-Nu'man responds to this very harsh criticism by saying, أَصْلَحَ اللَّهُ الْمَلِكِ. Let me please explain to you why you're wrong. And then he says, the Arabs are superior to everyone else because of حكمة ألسنتهم فإن الله تعالى أعطاهم في أشعارهم ورونق كلامهم وحسنه ووزنه وقوافيه مع معرفتهم بالأشياء وضربهم للأمثال وإبلاغهم في الصفات ما ليس لشيء من ألسنة الأجناس. So the anecdote, of course, ends with the king regretting his initial remark and recognizing the superiority of the Arabs. I open with this anecdote to show that in the 4th century in Cordoba, an adab work reiterates the recognized status of balagha as central to Arabic cultural identity and a persuasive aspect of knowledge production. In the story, the balagha is both the subject of the text and the meta-text. So it's balagha works, functions, but it also explains itself in the story. Rather than thinking of balagha in comparative framework with other literary traditions, what I would like to do today is explain the relationship of balagha to legitimacy within the Islamic context, and more specifically in Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus provides an ideal model to examine the relationship of speech and politics, because it's transitioned rather quickly from an emirate to a caliphate, and then it fell under the rule of Al-Muravids of North Africa. It regained its independence very shortly, and then it fell back again under the Almohads. Of this particular, and this all happened between the 4th and the 7th centuries, so it was very successive, very quick. Of this particular span of political change, I'm sharing with you one characterization of the relationship of the political and balagha, namely the centrality of the rhetoric of ittisaq, which developed through the cultivation of specific features of adab in relation to questions of legitimacy. Exploring the relationship between politics and speech has often positioned knowledge production within the realm of political arguments, and it was understood as a tool to buttress claims of legitimacy. It also has been limited to poetry and literary and historiographical genres that openly declare political agendas. But if we adopt this line of reasoning, many political events in Islamic history cannot be adequately explained. I can think of many examples, but for example, the grandson of Ali bin Abi Talib during the Abbasid Caliphate, as they were experimenting with the debates of legitimacy, there is the story that they circulate about a report of the son of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya taking a literal wasiyya, a piece of paper with a wasiyya that would guarantee and secure legitimacy for the Abbasids over their competitors, the Alids and the Umayyads. These and others cannot be explained if we look just at the political realm and not understand its relation to knowledge production and what was, at the time, what was considered authoritative and prestigious in the realm of knowledge production. Another premise we encounter on the relationship of speech and politics suggests direct access to the literary. And this has been imposed on how Arabic culture negotiated this relationship. And this assumption, more urgently perhaps, reduces the fabric of the multi-layered intimacy that marks this relationship. The last premise we encounter suggests that the question of legitimacy adheres to precedents and principles. But understanding legitimacy through precedents it follows or deviates from prioritizes established principles over contextual realities. And this certainly violates the processes of persuasion through which each and every political program innovated this relationship anew. When reading medieval Andalusi scholars writing historiographical and adab works, and I'm choosing here a number of the works that I studied so far, we can detect cross-generational conversations they're having with one another. This could be understood, of course, as shared investment in anthological projects and writing at the same stage of organizational knowledge. We also can understanding through the traditions of knowledge transmission. But what's quite remarkable about how these scholars think through each other in understanding Andalusi cultural identity is the primacy of the rhetoric of ittisaq in representing Al-Andalus and upholding its legitimacy. This comes in different forms, but coheres a shared vision that they reproduce and renew with each generation and to their respective audiences, always addressing new political challenges. So I want to share a few aspects of what I'm referring to here as ittisaq. In terms of conception of the rhetoric of affinity, ittisaq is one of several that were developed in multiple fields of knowledge production. But in the sources I shared with you earlier, it appears synonymous with other concepts like ijtima', nidam, nasaq, ittisaq. And although ittisaq is not primarily aesthetic in the sense that it doesn't directly invoke such implications, it certainly is influenced by the conflation of beauty and ethics as it appears in adab works at this stage of Andalusi culture. Al-Uqud, the necklace that I opened with, has an entire book on this relationship. Another point is that al-ittisaq does not attempt to explain the relationship of literature to history, as is often asked of these works, mainly by historians who tend to use them as sources for historical knowledge. Rather, we may think of ittisaq as a nuanced approach through which historiographical and adab works corresponded to the urgency of approaching shifting political enterprises whose claims to legitimacy embedded themselves within widely different registers. Instead of trying to find theoretical framework to understand these threads of discussions through which Andalusi scholars reordered their own culture through the rhetoric of ittisaq, I turned to one of the most prominent features of Arabic medieval culture, which I believe shaped the rhetoric of ittisaq by designating spaces and by providing the literary and conceptual tools that made it possible. I have one example here I can come back to, but what I'm referring to, this feature, is multiplicity, which had several forms. Knowledge production from an early point in Islamic culture privileged multiplicity, or the notion that there are multiple versions, multiple opinions, possible meanings, and explanations. This became the guiding feature of knowledge production in biographical dictionaries, in exegesis, in hadith collections, and it became the guiding principle in adab as well. This feature has been the focus of important scholarship, most notably Thomas Bauer, who wrote about it in his book, The Culture of Ambiguity, and then, of course, in fiqh, where we have the notion of ghalabat al-dhann, that we ought to understand legal debates were driven by rather than by an assumption or a search for the truth. This feature that developed in knowledge production became available culturally and informed debates of legitimacy in Andalus, as becomes evident in the rhetoric of ittisaq, which appears rather consistently in adab works produced in conversation with different political programs during these transitions in Al-Andalus. Now, let's see. So what I'm trying to suggest here, I'm going to reiterate in 2 points. The understanding of rhetoric through the interplay of the political and the literary in the question of legitimacy shows that the tools and attitudes developed in medieval knowledge production became the lens to apprehending political legitimacy at different junctures of Andalusi history. It is these that we need to consult and explore and think through as we attempt to understand the Arabic literary tradition. The second point is that debating political legitimacy through ittisaq makes us aware of the readership to which it was speaking to, and that's when we kind of understand that using the realm of knowledge production makes the political accessible, because this audience was quite familiar with the concept of multiplicity, and it had authority and prestige at the same time. Now, how can the examination of rhetoric of affinity inform an understanding of Andalusi legitimacy, and why does it matter, and also how does it relate to this conference? The rhetoric of ittisaq provide conception for apprehending Andalusi culture as it was imagined by Andalusi scholars themselves. The different forms of rulership used diverse formulation and innovated new arguments that had no precedent and also no successors. It was the scholars who had to perform an act of interpretation and representation. The urge to claim legitimacy collectively to all political periods of Al-Andalus is quite unique in how it situates Al-Andalus within a particular form of ijma' to secure its identity. It also must be recognized that the poetics produced within the realm of knowledge production forged forms of continuity that survived beyond and past the political and ideological shifts that it initially served. Understanding the interplay between the literary and the political matters also, because it allows, by exposing the politics of influence between these two realms, for reconstruction of the broader culture of Al-Andalus. It's possible, through the lens of rhetoric, to cohere trajectories of Andalusi intellectual life in which we may find an understanding of the endogenous dynamic debates through which rhetoric emerges as a process of persuasion specific to the Andalusi context. So in conclusion, I ask, when we speak of Al-Andalus, when we reimagine its history, is there an obligation to recognize this particular conception of ittisaq, especially with the almost inescapable political bent, tools of literary studies and the perspectives they provide assumed today? And if so, how can we do that? So I want to conclude by a line that kind of beautifully embodies this notion of اتساق. إن الخلافة فيكم لم تزل نسقا كالعقد منظومة فيه فرائده. And the idea is, with every rule, no matter how unique it was and how different from what followed, they all kind of coexist as different, unique phases, but in their placing them next to each other kind of creates this ittisaq. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Time-wise, we are doing very well. So we have questions. 10 minutes for any questions, comments.
Microphone. I'll just speak loudly. Okay. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. Just a kind of maybe technical, rhetorical question. As you were speaking, I kept thinking of the word or the term in Persian, iham, or that's also rendered tawliya in Arabic, I believe. I'm just wondering, when you're thinking about ambiguity, is that a rhetorical device that's relevant to the sources you're looking at, or something you deal with?
I think ambiguity is what Professor Bauer used to explain this feature in a broader, like.
Okay, so you wouldn't reduce it, or you don't see that rendered in like specific rhetorical figures, such as.
So what I was thinking of was more of how, not the actual discussion of rhetoric in these works, because they do, like as I mentioned, Al-Aqd, for example, in several books, it's an anthology of 25 volumes, and it has several books that are either entirely dedicated to rhetoric or contain major chapters discussing rhetoric. But what I was kind of looking at was more of how it kind of informed an understanding of culture. So it starts from rhetoric in knowledge production, but I think it kind of creates these values and attitudes in the culture which are, avail themselves to other areas as well. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, how can we consider Al-Aqd Al-Farid a book, connected with Andalusian culture? Because the book, as said, Sahib ibn Abbad, this was some kind of repeated books from eastern parts of Arabic Caliphate, and his anti-Shubi parts maybe is taken from Ibn Qutayba and Jahiz, maybe other, even Arud, Khalil bin Ahmad al-Farahidi was, we lost this book, but due to Al-Aqd al-Farid, we have some information about his work. But you are speaking just like Andalusian. I think besides his Urjuza, which connected to Andalusian history, we don't have much evidence that this book is related to Andalusian poetry, Andalusian literary studies.
Yes, thank you for your question. There is this anecdote that circulates whenever you mention Al-Aqd, that a copy of it was presented to Sahib bin Abbad, the famous vizier, and that he threw it away and said, بضاعتنا ردت إلينا. But actually that anecdote must have been assigned to an earlier time period, but it came much later. And actually Al-Aqd was reproduced in Al-Mashriq. There are over 100 manuscripts in different parts of the Mashriq, which indicates it was quite popular.
Excuse me, the first book mentions that 7 oaths, mu'allaqat.
Yeah.
It was about mu'allaqat. This is first book that mu'allaqat was hanged.
So you mentioned Ibn Qutayba. Ibn Qutayba was the largest anthology produced in Baghdad when Al-Aqd 70 years later was produced, and it was 12 volumes, and Al-Aqd was 25 volumes also. So it had a bigger project, and it also was intimately connected with the Caliphal project. Al-Andalus was moving from being an emirate, a local emirate, to claiming to be the capital of the Islamic world. And Al-Aqd was kind of reproducing this Eastern culture and, providing the spaces for cultural legitimacy through producing the entirety of Arabic culture. It also, this is an example, the entire book 15 of Al-Aqd, the second adorable jewel on caliphs, their histories and battles. This is a book in which Ibn Abd Rabbi reimagines Islamic history from the beginning until the end, and it actually very unique from beginning to end. He kind of recreates the trajectory of legitimacy from the Prophet, Mecca, Medina to Damascus. He skips the Abbasids and he moves to Al-Andalus, and he actually does not he does not admit the transition from emirate to a caliphate. He calls all Umayyad emirs caliphs from Abdurrahman I until Abdurrahman III, who he celebrates. And his Urjuza is not a poem, not just a poem. His Urjuza is one of our... Yeah. His Urjuza is 460 lines, and it's not just recording, it's recording all the achievements of Abdurrahman III, al-Nasir, but also it's telling us a lot about everything, from the values to what was going on, to how they perceived the northern kingdoms, to how they looked at themselves, to how they positioned themselves in relation to the rest of the Arab world, the Islamic world at the time. So it's it's very Andalusi in that sense, and also even later works that reproduce Andalusi material, they all borrowed from Al-Aqd. It was quite important, and his explanation of this notion of ittisaq, was reproduced in later works. Yes, no, you're welcome.
Thank you. I hate being facetious, but I was really struck by the affinity between our respective approaches, because insofar as scholarship considers a relationship between politics and aesthetics, the literary and the political, it is usually by granting this primacy to the political and using its categories to explicate literary events or texts that are actually events. So I really appreciate the fact that you are short-circuiting that and trying to think of ways in which the political is fashioned through the literary and through certain elaboration of tropological language. And I like that note of insistence on which you ended your response to the last question, right? That there is something specifically Andalusi about these texts. So I will just, this is not a very well formulated and precise question, but I will just like to invite you to elaborate on why this kind of discourse of binding the literary and the political emerges from that particular geopolitical formation. What makes Al-Andalus so special that it would give rise to the discourse of ittisaq in thinking in a literary fashion about the political and in conceiving political legitimacy through literary language.
Yeah, thank you. I'm encouraged that more scholarship is coming that is not referring to adab as a tool that in the service of the political. I don't think in this specific argument Al-Andalus is alone or unique. The example I gave about al-wasiyya, I think it's very it's from Baghdad, right? And it's at a time when isnad and transmission and also meeting scholars in person was given very authoritative, prestige. And that's when the political in Baghdad kind of borrowed from traditions of knowledge production. I think what makes Al-Andalus unique in looking at ittisaq, first that Al-Andalus, although it's always considered part of the Islamic world, and it was, it nonetheless was always aware. Scholars, you see, they were always aware of how to position themselves in relation to the rest of the Islamic world. It wasn't just like, and also we cannot forget that they were always thinking of themselves in relation to the kingdoms in the north and of North Africa. Some of the examples I mentioned here are from the Fada'il al-Buldan literature, which is nothing like the Fada'il Bayt al-Maqdis that are much more popular. In Al-Andalus, Fada'il al-Buldan, it's a fascinating genre for Al-Andalus because it looks at Al-Andalus within the immediate context. So the comparison is not with the rest of the Islamic world, it's with North Africa and the northern kingdoms. And I think I mentioned that this succession of political changes that did not happen anywhere else in the Islamic world. And actually the move from a caliphate to the Ta'ifa kingdoms, so from claiming to be an Islamic caliphate to moving to forms of rulership that were unprecedented, right? Every city became a kingdom. Every king of every city had to think of ways of making themselves relevant. That's when we have, for example, a competition in funding scholars, right? Patronage, becomes it becomes the area for competition. But that changes very quickly. They last less than 100 years. And then you have new Almoravids had completely different political program, and Almohads were, they claimed to have a Mahdi, and they changed everything. And with that, they changed the architecture, they changed the slogans, they changed the banners. So the changes, I think, made the idea of thinking of a continuity of what does it mean to be Andalusi, And a lot of them ask that question. Like Ibn Hazm, who was writing during the fitna. So that's fitna ended in 423 Hijri, which is 1031. And the fitna lasted about 23 years. It was a time of turmoil. 9 different rulers, had very successful, very short and brief tenure, and that ended violently. And that was when Cordoba was ransacked and Zahra was burned to the ground. And so Ibn Hazm writing, he thinks, what does it mean to be Andalusi? And and he says, whoever comes to us becomes one of us. من جاء إلينا من سائر البلدان فهو منا ونحن أحق به. So that becomes like it matters to ask this question, which I don't think we find it in that urgency in the rest of the Islamic world, or perhaps we do. But it has that, it's unique in that sense that I was thinking of the political context. It was in conversation with these changing claims of legitimacy and was producing, That was. But thank you for your work and for the question.
Time is pressing again, and we should turn to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Feryal Bouhafa, University of Cambridge. Her paper is entitled The Quranic Rhetorical Challenge Within the Scope of Peripatetic Rhetoric in Ibn Rushd's Thought. Yeah, please.
I'd like to also thank Hani for putting up this great conference, and Rania for all the logistical help. And thank you for the introduction. The title of my presentation is The Quranic Rhetorical Challenge in Ibn Rushd's Thought. Specifically, just to contextualize my talk, I would be addressing the question of rhetoric from a philosophical kind of context, and the aim is to address Ibn Rushd's reception of Aristotle's rhetoric, and how does that inform his view of rhetorical speech. I would like also to discuss Ibn Rushd's engagement with the concept of Quranic rhetorical challenge, tahaddi, as the basis for Muhammad's prophecy, often discussed in the context of balagha. And here what I'd like, the aim is to kind of try to draw some parallel between what is often referred to as peripatetic rhetoric, as Aristotelian rhetoric, khataba, and Arabic rhetoric, balagha, in the context of Averroes's work. And this specifically, I'd like to challenge certain presumption that, in fact, one cannot really find or draw any parallel between the two genres, such as a claim that was made by an excellent scholar of balagha, Pierre Larcher, that in fact when you compare Aristotelian rhetoric, which is in the context of a Athenian democracy, with the theological Islamic context, one cannot really talk about argumentation, a claim that I'll try to show that it's actually can be challenged. My thesis is I would like to argue that Ibn Rushd's conceptions of the Quranic challenge, tahaddi, and I will explain what I'm talking about here, both in his commentaries to Aristotle's rhetoric and religious writing, is void of any theological claims. Instead, Ibn Rushd anchors the argumentative ground for the prophetic challenge on practical basis through the notion of nusb al-ayn. Such practical construal of prophetic rhetorical challenge becomes the basis for the appraisal of all rhetorical speech. In so doing, Ibn Rushd adds a new provision to Aristotelian rhetorical argumentation, which requires practical efficiency in delivering arguments and attests to cross-pollination between peripatetic rhetoric, khataba, and Arabic rhetoric. Let me start here saying something about khataba in general, and what is the difference between Aristotelian rhetoric and Arabic rhetoric. So when we talk about Aristotelian rhetoric, we're talking about rhetoric we're talking in the Arabic context. We're specifically talking about commentaries that were written by Arabic philosopher. I mean, starting from Al-Kindi. Unfortunately, the text was lost. Averroes, Ibn Sina, Farabi, etc., that engaged with Aristotle's rhetoric, and in fact, a very interesting contribution that they brought, which has been underlined recently by Deborah Black, that not only that they just commented on Aristotle's rhetoric, but they provided an epistemological framework to really argue that rhetoric is part of the logical art, and specifically that rhetoric as a persuasive art, it in fact produces what is a logical impact, which is to produce assent in people's mind. So this is important to understand this, but I would say that Averroes or Ibn Rushd, as much as Avicenna and Farabi, they were also aware that there's another, what one can call an indigenous tradition, that is balagha, and often they try to kind of address this tradition within this perspective of Aristotle's rhetoric. And I'd like to say something about how does Averroes expresses what is a proper rhetorical speech. And here I'd like to start with what Aristotle says. In fact, Aristotle, in discussing rhetorical speech, admits specifically a metaphor as a species of rhetorical speech, and says that it should set the scene before our eyes, for events ought to be seen in progress rather than in prospect. This is in Aristotle's Rhetoric, Book 3. Averroes takes up this attribute of metaphor and explains that all rhetorical speech shall aspire to set the scene before our eyes. And he uses the term al-mushahada bil-basar, and specifically to set things nusb al-ayn, to set them in front of the person's eyes. In fact, so this capacity to visualize an image in front of people's eyes is presented as a general feature required in all rhetorical speech, and not specific element of rhetoric, that is the metaphor. So here Averroes is actually, often he's perceived as a loyal commentator of Aristotle, but actually that is not entirely true, because he also stamped his own mark in reading Aristotle's rhetoric, and in fact this is where his Arabic context comes into play. And before I kind of address how does Averroes' understanding of the nature of rhetorical speech is influenced by his context, I would like to say something about this notion of nusb al-ayn. Where does he get it from? I mean, it's clearly in Aristotle, but there's another influence, which is Farabi's influence. Farabi, in his Alfaz al-Mustamila fil Mantiq, defines the use of nusb al-ayn as a teaching tool in abstract matters, such as metaphysical questions. And the example that he gives is one should draw a circle instead of providing a definition of the circle. And this is like a pedagogical tool of visualizing things that are abstract for people. And Fusus Farabi also associates this feature of nusb al-ayn to the example of the lawgiver and doctor's capacity to heal the soul or the body as a ground to testify for being actual doctor or lawgiver. So you trust a doctor for being a doctor because you could see that the doctor has the capacity to heal. Similarly, you trust a lawgiver for being a lawgiver because he brought a law that can be revealed or not. Building up on Farabi, Averroes takes this concept of nusb al-ayn, and as I will show in the rest of my presentation, links this specifically to the rhetorical challenge that is often associated with the Prophet and the Quranic revelation as the basis for the Prophet's claim. Here I would like to start with this quote from Averroes' Al-Kashf on the concept of challenge, tahaddi. Tahaddi is a concept that is often discussed in relation to the inimitability of the Quran. The Quran as being a challenge, and specifically Averroes here presents the argument on how Quran is a challenge, that referring to Quran, the two surahs from Quran 17:88 and 11:13, and he says here, I read, however, the thing by which he summoned people to believe and with what He, i.e. the Prophet, challenged them in the precious book, for God said, "Say, even if all mankind and jinn came together to produce something like this Quran, they could not produce anything like it, however much they helped each other. If they say," and this is another surah that he quotes, "He has invented it himself, say then produce 10 invented surahs like it, and call in whoever you can beside God if you're truthful." This being the case, the miracle of the Prophet with which he challenged people, in which he advanced as a proof for the truth of his claim to his message, was the precious book. So basically, Averroes addresses how God challenged people to provide a book equal to the Quran in terms of its clarity and rhetorical feature, referring to the passages, like I said, from the Quran known as the challenge verses. Averroes and the rest of the passage here, he also identifies the two positions that are known among Ash'arites and Mu'tazilites. So some Muslim theologians held that the divine speech in itself is miraculous based on its rhetorical eloquence, and others believe that it was not the speech in itself, but its uniqueness, such is the position of some of the Mu'tazilites, who propounded also the doctrine of sarf, which meant that people could technically produce a text like the Quran, but they were deterred by God from producing a text like it. So this is what he first kind of lays out, the two positions, and then he will present his position. But before I continue with the passage from Al-Kashf, I'd like to show here another passage in his short commentary to Aristotle's Rhetoric, where he talks about the challenge specifically. And he says, here I quote, "Challenge may be made by means of different things. However, the most persuasive challenge is the one that is made by means of the completely unprecedented miracle, i.e. by the performance of something considered impossible by mankind. But it is obvious, even if the feat is extremely marvelous, that it provides nothing more than good opinion about the one who performs the feat, or nothing more than trust in him and in his excellence when the feat is divine." So basically what Averroes is arguing here is the argumentative ground for Muhammad's prophecy is embedded in the fact that he performed the most persuasive challenge. The revelation is made by means of an unprecedented miracle. But then he says, if you see, and I go back here, but it is obvious, even if the feat is extremely marvelous, that it provides nothing more than good opinion. So meaning that even if it might come up unprecedented and marvelous to people, the end of the day, the main premise is that the Prophet holds good opinions and is trustworthy. This is the essence of the challenge. And he avoids to grant, so clearly here he avoids to grant prophecy on the basis of theological claims. And I mean, it's often the case that Averroes rejects the basis of the Mutakallimun, and he criticize them for trying to base prophecy on rational ground. So what is the basis then of Muhammad's prophecy, and how does he understand this challenge if it's just merely you have a trustworthy person with good opinion? And now I go back to the rest of the passage in the Kashf. Averroes say that the Quran is a proof of the truthfulness of his prophecy, peace be upon him, is built for us upon two principles to which the book itself alerted us. The first being that the existence of the type of people called messengers and prophets is known by virtue of itself. They are the type of people who lay down laws for other people by divine revelation and not by human education. This existence can be denied only by the people who deny the concurrent al-umur al-mutawatira as the existence of all things, which we have not seen, the lives of the famous philosophers, and so forth. Philosophers and all people agree, except those who pay no regard to their words. And these are the Dahiriya. That there are certain persons among people to whom have been revealed many commandments for the people in matters related to knowledge and beautiful actions, which fulfill their happiness and prescribe wrong beliefs and ugly action. This is the act of a prophet. So he's basically saying, I mean, we know both philosophers and people agree the existence of these lawgivers, basically, and unless you are skeptical on the basis of referring to the Dahiriya here as the Dahiris, those are people that would not accept concurrent opinions. The second principle is that he who performs this act that is lying out of law revealed from the God, the Almighty, is a prophet. This is a principle that is not doubted on the basis of humans' innate disposition, for in the same way it is known by virtue of itself that the act of doctor is healing, so he who performs healing is a doctor. Likewise, it is known by virtue of itself that the act of prophets, peace be upon him, is to lay down laws based on divine revelation, and he who performs this act is a prophet. So basically the epistemological basis of the challenge for him is the shahada, the testimony, which is based on a tawatur. The basis of a human knowledge of the past in general is concurrent. Tawatur, people's way of understanding the things they have not observed themselves, such as the existence of famous philosophers and the existence of those who come to lay out the laws needed to fulfill happiness. Second, the agreement between people and philosophers is central, for it relates to the mahmudat, which is the praiseworthy premises, and this is basically the highest rank among rhetorical premises that is often used in argumentation, and this type of premises are shared. Their praiseworthiness is shared by philosophers and people. The epistemological basis of the prophecy is testimony of tawatur and the consensual basis between people and philosophers. Now, this epistemological ground, which is rhetorical ground, has a practical basis, which is what I link to the concept of nusbal ayn. So the basis of the argument is grounded in humans' innate disposition to believe that whoever, he says, performs the act of healing is a doctor. Similarly, he who performs the act of bringing a law is a prophet. So, and this brings us back to what Farabi associated to bringing things in front of people's eyes, nusbal ayn. The testimony of the lawgiver is rooted in his capacity to bring things in front of people's eyes through delivering a concrete practical outcome that is healing or establishing a revealed law. The ground of prophecy hinges on practical arguments shared by people and philosopher, which is the success of the law to better lives and calling people to good actions and the avoidance of evil action. This is, for Averroes, is self-evident and experienced by human beings. So this takes me to my conclusion. So what I try to suggest is, unlike certain presumption that in the realm of rhetoric, in Islamic rhetoric, theology reigns over argumentation. I tried to show that Ibn Rushd, in fact, departs from theological claims as a basis for prophecy. Rather, he shows that the adherence to the revealed law is rooted in epistemological and practical ground of rhetoric, and specifically the notion of nusbal ayn. This rhetorical ground for the claim of prophecy informs his view on what is proper rhetorical speech and underlines a pragmatic and efficient basis to argumentation. So when he says, I show that for Aristotle, this bringing things in front of people's eyes is just limited to metaphor. For Averroes, it's all rhetorical speech. If you want to be persuasive, that's what you shall aspire. And this is clearly, I would argue, informed by his understanding of the most persuasive arguments that in this context, which is the challenge. So this reading could, what I'm also suggesting, that it could be a basis for seeing some sort of a cross-pollination between Aristotelian rhetoric and Arabic rhetoric, where Averroes is trying to bring the two in some sort of understanding, and his own understanding of rhetoric, and that's, if anything, shows Averroes as a philosopher who's thinking of his own context, yet also interacting with the philosophical framework of Aristotle. Thank you.
We have approximately 15 minutes for questions, comments. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. So, as someone who has written on more than one occasion that these are two completely separate things, I think there's no doubt that, I think you're absolutely right that Ibn Rushd is clearly attempting a synthesis, and he's deliberately using the label khitaba because he knows, like you said, from his study of the organon, that it's part of the organon, so it's part of the Aristotelian project, and he's trying, like Hazm al-Qartajani, he's trying to integrate the two projects, and he doesn't want to. And I think that it's fascinating that that part of the Islamic ulum side is that he brings in the discourse about inimitability and the tahaddi. I think the question I would ask is, do you think going forward, or even just thinking in terms of it's difficult to say, to make these kinds of claims of the kind of weight of scholarly consensus at the time, most people weren't necessarily doing these things under the label of khitaba. It's like, so when somebody like Ibn Rushd it's not that the work isn't being done, like about how inimitability is connected to persuasion, and how persuasion is part of the science of thinking about language. But do you think you could say one might be able to say something like, if in this period you bring in that specific label khitaba, then you're trying to make a sort of culturally and specifically charged argument about integrating two separate traditions. Do you see what I mean? It's like, might you be tempted to say something like the use of the label is an indication that somebody is trying to synthesize separate traditions?
Yeah. I'm not sure I understood clearly your question. Sorry. You mean synthesis between Aristotelian rhetoric and Balagha. I think it's even much more of a larger project that he's doing, and I think often Averroes is always perceived in this, through this lens of synthesis. I actually perceive him differently in the sense of reshuffling things. So it's not so much about bringing Aristotelian rhetoric with Balagha so much, but it's actually he's doing something he's fulfilling something that he's reaching to, rather than the synthesis itself. And my answer would be is that Averroes is very much committed to make a really drastic rupture with theological, dialectical theology as a basis for belief for people. So, like I mentioned, adherence to the law is actually on the basis of, for him, it's Sharia that basically what attests to what should be the basis for adhering to the law, and not dialectical theology. And I'm again, I would say that it's really it is built up around this practical argument that you believe in your belief to the in Sharia is based on the fact that you know it's a good law and there's a practical outcome out of it. So again, it feeds in this practical understanding of this is all you need for people to believe. You don't need to address it in rational theological discussion. So I see it more of fulfilling something he's really after, rather than really being so much about the synthesis. The whole legal, I think, all legal mechanism and legal reasoning, he also understands it under the scope of rhetorical argumentation, which is not surprising in terms of, it fits very well with the epistemological basis of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the realm of ghalabat al-zann, and law is the realm of ghalabat al-zann. So I think I see it more fulfilling his a practical project rather than just the synthesis.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be very clear with my question. You said that in the opinion of Ibn Rushd, only skeptics can challenge the Quran, yes? And over the years, skeptics in Islamic world challenged the Quran. Abu Lala al-Ma'arri wrote a book, Al-Fusul wal-Ghayat. Besides that, Abu Atahiya said that I read Amma Yatasa'alun. After that, I wrote a poem better than this surah. Abu Atahiya lived in a period of Mu'tazili ideological hegemony in Islamic world. This was a period when Mihnat Khalq al-Quran happened in Islamic world, and Quran considered to be makhluk, not an eternal word of God. I just wanted to know what was opinion, if yes, of Ibn Rushd in this case. In accordance to Ibn Rushd, the Quran was makhluk, or the Quran was eternal word of God. Thank you.
I don't know if I can answer the question, because I didn't mean skeptics in the sense of what you think of skeptics. I just meant specifically this group that he mentions, the Dahriya, which are known for not accepting things that are accepted opinions. So that's all I would say for now.
Showed his opinion on Mu'tazili theology, because this is very important important issue. Is the Quran makhluk, or the Quran eternal, everlasting word of God, as Orthodox Islam accepts it?
But why? I don't understand on the basis.
His opinion.
Not here, yeah. Not here. He doesn't address that question here. He does in the Tahafut where he answers to Ghazali, but...
Thank you.
Any other questions? Because
Okay. Now our third speaker, Chiara Fontana from University of Rome. Her paper is entitled Exploring a Pragmatic Approach to the Rhetorical and Metrical Analysis of Contemporary Arabic Poetry, Najib Surur's Kelimat fi al-Hub.
I cannot see the mouse. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be here with you at this prestigious and wonderful workshop. So I would like to thank you for your presence, and above all, I would like to thank Dr. Hani, Rashwan, and Rania that who helped us really much in this day, long day. So thank you very much. I obtained my PhD in Arabic linguistics and literature on the February of this last year with a PhD dissertation on Najib Surur. My dissertation was a linguistic, rhetorical, and metrical analysis of Najib Surur's poetical, critical, and theatrical production. So during this last research, I paid attention to جيل الستينيات والسبعينيات, so the 16th and 70s generation of Egyptian authors, and to the evolution of the text in Ammiya and Fusha. Since I have been lived into the Arab world since several years, I gained the opportunity to begin deeply engaged with Balagha and Ilm al-Arud studies. And in my previous researches, I have always employed a cultural embedded approach to the text analysis. And this is in order to enhance the semantic and aesthetical richness of some so-called subaltern genres within the Arabic literary tradition, such as epistolary literature, vernacular poetry, theatrical production, and above all, experimental poetry, as in the case of Najib Surur. So I would like to start with a brief methodological overview, and then let's move to the rhetorical and metrical analysis of Kalimat fil Hub. And I would like to start with this quotation from Al-Jurjani, because this applicative approach to the rhetorical and metrical analysis inspired my previous studies and researches on Al-Jurjani, especially Dalail al-Ijaz and Asrar al-Balagha. So Al-Jurjani said that it's really impossible to criticize a literary text without an initial inquiry on its full meaning. So this inquiry starts with the observation of al-kalima, the smallest unit within linguistic utterance, so the word, proceeds through the observation of the linkages among words, so syntactic and grammatical linkages among words, so at-tartib and al-i'rab, and then moves to the observation of the most important, the most famous part of Jurjani literary theory, which is a nadam, so the semantic and formal structure of the text, and all these inquiries according to the aims of the composition and to its context. So this approach, Giorgiani's model for the text analysis, which was followed by Giorgiani's students such as Zamakhshari, but also by many other scholars such as Qazwini, Sakaki, that renewed the pattern by other paths of researches. Of course, it doesn't apply only to pre-modern texts, but also to contemporary ones, because it attests the presence of a pre-modern literary theory into the Arab tradition, and so avoiding the employment of an Eurocentric and fully thematic perspective of inquiry. So I would like to quote briefly also Ibn al-Athir, who said that the literary text is the best expression of an Arabic communicatively incisive text. So, starting from this quotation, from this quote, we can say that at the very basis of the construction of the literary text, we can find the three important elements. So, the employment of the strategies delineated by the three branches of the Balagha. Every author's managing of the ontological status of words and meaning in a specific, directed and contextual manner. And the third, the other perennial continuity or estrangement with his or her previous models. Nonetheless, the most part of the some pragmatics-inspired studies on al-Balagha still observe Balagha's strength and form as a fully prerogative linguistic subject, and readily investigating literary consideration that really arise from texts such as Asrar al-Balagha or from al-Qazwini, al-Tahanawi, up to modern Arabic rhetoric scholars such as Ahmed Matlub or Emil Badi Yaqub. So I think that without a welcomed shift from the linguistic studies on al-Balagha to the literary ones, it's really difficult to mark the difference among the text taqlidi, so the traditional text, and the text tajribi, and the experimental one. And this will also allow us in contributing to a paradigm shift away from an Eurocentric perspective of inquiry in order to observe some genres and some part of Arabic literary production from a cross-temporal perspective. So, moving from theory to practice, in what consists an applicative, rhetorical and metrical approach to the text analysis. So inspired by Giorgiani, this model tries to transpose the observation and the analysis from micro levels of inquiry to macro levels of inquiry. So if Giorgiani paid attention to the observation of the single word, I think that besides this, so looking at the text always word by word and verse by verse, we have also to observe the whole composition. And if Giorgiani paid attention to the grammatical and syntactic linkages among words, I think that we could try to pay attention to the linkages between the work that we are analyzing and its previous or contemporary models. And lastly, if Giorgiani paid attention to the semantic and formal structure of the text, according to the aims of the text and the composition, we have to try to insert this, the text that we are analyzing into its full context. So I think that this approach is analytical and synthetic because it tries to dive into the text, but at the same time to sum up some relevant conclusions, and centripetal and centrifugal, because we try to get as much as possible closer to the text, but at the same time we want also to keep us at a distance enough from it in order to well understand the text in its full context. So, I would like to start with the analysis of Kalimat fil Hub, taking a brief look at the context, and the aims of the composition. Najib Surur was an Egyptian poet, dramatist, and literary critic, and was an exponent of Jil Sittiniyat to Sab'iniyat, so the 16th and 70th generation of Egyptian authors who gave birth to an eclectic and brilliant cultural scene, inspired by the Marxist values of 1952's revolution, and demanding a deep commitment to social change, a redefinition of some of previous literary canons, the rejection of passive engagement with political powers, but above all, an engagement with new personal path of artistic research. So Najib Surur belonged to this generation, but his main feature was that he was an independent author. So Najib Surur, in fact, wasn't linked with a specific literary movement, such as latest socialist realism or avant-garde movements. And there are also two features that well describe his approach to literature. First, Najib Surur has an outstanding and variegated cultural background, which brings together a true love for the Arabic folk literature, Al-Ma'arri quartets, the Abbasid genres of scoring genre of Mujun, Brecht, Stanislavski, the ancient Greek theater. But at the same time, he loves to employ different compositional techniques. Why we say that Najib Surur is a borderline case study? Because Najib Surur was both appreciated and neglected by the critics of this time. And this is largely due to his violent outpourings against Nasser policy and then Sadat policies. So Najib Surur suffered a physical and an artistic ostracism. And he was censored from the 70s up to 2011, when above all, the youngest Egyptian generations looked at Najib Surur as a sort of a hyper-politicized rebel genius, as opposite to the incredible figure of intellectual who he was. So, it's really difficult to sum up Najib Surur's work in a few words, especially for me. But I would like to describe briefly his approach to poetry. So he distinguishes himself as a poet of الشعر المقفى التفعيلي or al-Khalili, so the Arabic traditional verse poetry, as in رباعيات Najib Surur. But he also was a poet of الشعر الحر غير التفعيلي, so according to the model of Amin al-Rihani. At the same time, Najib Surur experimented mainstreamed the two new poetic genres. The first is شعر للمسرح. So it's a kind of lyrical composition strongly influenced by some dramaturgical writing features such as plot, character, and many others. And the second is a renewed pattern of Nazak al-Malaika and Shukri Sayyab's Iraqi school model of شعر الحر التفعيلي, which in its original model demands the employment, the circular and punctual employment or one or more tafailat, so metrical foods, for the whole composition, avoiding the employment of traditional methods. So كلمة في الحب is an experimental example of شعر الحر التفعيلي. The aims of the composition. According to an Eurocentric or fully thematic perspective of inquiry, كلمة في الحب has the thematic feature of a real canonical exile poem. It was written in Budapest during Najib Surur's exile in the city due to his violent outpourings against Nasser policy. And as every exile poem, we can find a poet struggled between his longing from the missing homeland and beloved ones, and the loyalty to his own ideals and moral outlook. We have to remember that Najib Surur was a communist intellectual. The key theme is al-hubb, so the love, which is understood as a sort of humanism-inspired belief, which comforts the poet in the jail of his solitude. And the structure is a sort of inner dialogue among Surur and his troubled soul. So let's start with our metrical analysis. Kalimat fil Hubb is one of Najib Surur's briefest composition. It consists of only 20 verses, organized in 10 couplets, 6 of them according to الصورة الكاملة للبحر البسيط, so the complete form of Basit Matter, and 4 of them according to صورة المجزوء للبحر الرجس, so the incomplete form of Rajas matter. But what is unusual in this kind of composition? The alternation of 2 methods is not an uncommon choice within the Arabic literary tradition since Jahiliyyah's time. But this very employment is not allowed by the rules of علم العروض of تفعيلات, which demands the employment either of the complete form of a method or another one, or the incomplete form for the whole composition. So this is the first threat, experimental threat that we find. But why we say that Kalimat fil Hubb is an example of, is an experimental example of شعر الحر التفعيلي and not an experimental model of شعر المقفى التفعيلي. So the answer is at the second step of our metrical analysis of Kalimat fil Hubb. We are at the first couplet, and which is composed according to الضرب المقطوع الطم للبحر البسيط. So as we know, there's a great difference among بحر, ضرب, and وزن, because البحر, so the matter, provides the theoretical metrical pattern that sometimes never occurs in poetry for a huge number of reasons, and here we can return also to the linkages among Arabic metrics and Persian ones and so on. But ad-darb is a canonical variation of this pattern according to the specific occurrence of some high-impact metrical variations that we call ilal, or low-impact metrical variations that we call zihaf. So, another important remark, when we deal with metrical analysis, firstly we have to pay attention to the hemistic and then to the whole verse. So this is why we have 2 verses analyzed as 4 hemistics. So we can notice that تفعيلة العروض of the first verse, which is the last تفعيلة of the first hemistic, is مقطوع. So it's invested by a high-impact metrical variation that is called قطع. So hence we have الضرب المقطوع. Okay. And تفعيلة الضرب, which is the last تفعيلة of the verse, is مقطوع as well. But in the second verse, the تفعيلة العروض, as we could notice, is مقبونة. So it's invested by a low-impact metrical variation. And the تفعيلة الضرب is مقطوع. This very kind of employment is not allowed by علم العروض والتفعيلات rules. That Surur, of course, knows really well, because very well, because he was a poet of الشعر المقفى التفعيلي and composed the 222 رباعيات. So here he seems to compose the text as verse by verse, because according to علم العروض وتفعيلات rules, if in the first verse we have both تفعيلة العروض and الضرب مقطوع, this very pattern must be refrained for the whole composition. This is why we say that it's composed as verse by verse. Besides this, Najib Surur employs, despite his deliberate violations of metrical rules, employs really canonical rhyming patterns. So قافية وحيدة, rhyming couplets or alternating couplets. So some remarks, metrical remarks. We can notice an ازدواجية عمودية, so metrical splitting. But the most important thing, بنية البيت الخطية, so the single verse structure. And this is because this poem is an experimental model of الشعر الحر التفعيلي, because this feature is the most important one in الشعر الحر التفعيلي and is not present in, of course, in Arabic traditional verse poetry. And then we have noticed قافية وحيدة, so rhyming couplet, alternating couplet, all details that lead us to the conclusion that the poem structure fits with poem's theme and aims, giving life to an inner dialogue among Surur and his soul. Let's move briefly to the rhetorical analysis in order to discover the semantic richness of the text. The first element is genus. We are still at the first couplet. This is why I said we have to look at the first step of our analysis to the whole work, but always pay attention word by word and verse by verse. So here we have a genus الاشتقاق, which is a genus ناقص, of course, and a genus تام. And I would really like also to observe the presence of a tikrar. So a tikrar is that very kind of repletion that brings also to the text a strong cohesion between the terms relating to the same semantic sphere. So we have the repletions 2 times of the term al-hub and of its synonym al-hawa. But we can also notice 2 main semantic spheres within the composition. So the spiritual and religious one, through several examples such as amantu, usalli, mihrab, dini, and the second related to the homeland, as through the example and the terms employed such as al-ard, tamfini, watani. Here we have, for example, the coexistence of several two figures of speech at the same time. We have tashbih and amajaz. This tashbih is the tashbih tam. Okay, thank you. So, ولا حبك الأرض فتنفيني. Of course, التشبيه تام, so مشبه لحب, أداة التشبيه مشبه بالأرض, وجه التشبيه المنفى. But as we can notice, this last figure of speech is somehow hidden into another figure of speech, which is المجاز العقلي بالقرينة المحلية. So it what Abderraouf calls and translates as a cognitive allegory. I disagree with this translation because, in my opinion, it doesn't translate the full meaning of al-majaz al-aqli. So this is why before I said I always prefer to explain the figures, because this very kind of approach put us in front several in-depth ontological issues about Arabic rhetoric. So as we will show, so al-majaz al-aqli is that very kind of a majaz in which the poet substituted the real subject, which is in this case is the Egyptian government, with an allegorical one. That in this case the al-ard, the earth, is not provided with critical thinking. So it's impossible that for the earth to exile everyone. So. And at the very basis of this relationship, we have a place relationship. And then we have a majaz al-mursal mabni al-mahliya, in which instead of the hearth, the poet makes reference to the homeland. I would like to do some further consideration on al-majaz al-mursal, if possible. And because sometimes al-majaz al-mursal is translated as linguistic allegory, metaphorical language, sometimes also as metaphor as well. But this very kind of approach put us in front of some challenging, in-depth inquiries about the ontological status of Arabic imagination. So, as I said before, we have always to think that the 2 linguistic processes that govern the 4 major forms of ilm al-bayan are al-ithbath and al-tathbit and al-muthbat. So without an in-depth knowledge of these processes, it's really difficult to proceeds for a taxonomy of some figures of speech, and despite several scholars such as Garcetti, Owens, Pierre Larcher translate al-kinaya as metonymy, if we compare the 9 typologies of Majaz al-Mursal with the typologies of metonymy within Thomas Lowan's Dictionary of Rhetoric, we can find some shared points. So I think we have to reflect about this topic. And here we have Mihrab al-Hawa Watani. So the concept is love is my faith. But Surur, instead of this utterance, says and substitutes this utterance, employing a term which stands for a concrete place of faith, so mihrab. And in this process involves also a challenging place shift, because mihrab's direction is not Mecca, but Egypt, his homeland. We have Tibaq and Muqabala al-Aqsiyya, but I guess we have no time to dealing with this. I would like to make reference to the last example, so in which we have at verse number 18 the coexistence of several figures of speech at the same time. So we have Tibaq, 2 types of Tibaq. We have Tibaq Ijabi, so antithesis through antonyms both in the affirmative form. أجرتكم جيتكم. طباق إجازي, so an antithesis through indirect references that give life to a chromatic oxymoron. So الذمان, which is a common feature for the youth, and shayb, which is a common feature for the old age. We have a jinas naqas among shayb and shababi. And then the most important one, we have an istiara makniya, which is an iqtibas at the same time. So, harik al-shayb. Why we say that this is an istiara makniya and a nota kinaya an al-mawsuf? An istiara makniya is a really effective form of simile, so it's a metaphor. But in this case, it is strongly influenced by some kinayas features. So in order to make the difference among these 2 forms, we have to reconstruct the implicit simile of the metaphor. So al-mushabba, my black hair turns into grey white, as a fire turns dark coal into ash due to the old age. I would like to recall Heinrichs one said in his paper of 1984 about the istiara and kinaya, that kinaya process always proceeds from the consequent to the antecedent, as in the most famous example of the kinaya, qabila kathirat wal-ramad. But in istiara one, always from the antecedent to the consequent. So in the text we have a harik, we have no mention to the hash. We have the antecedent and not the consequence. And this is why we are sure that this is an istiara makniya and not a kinaya an al-mawsuf. At the same time, this is an iqtibas from Al-Quran, in which Prophet Zakaria says that despite his old age, which a main feature is gray or white hair, he still prays God with strong affection. So Najib Surur, despite his misfortune, still trusts in love. Some concluding remarks. We observed several rhetorical structure marked by muhassinat lafdiyya as jinas tikrar, atibaq-based structure, employment of majaz and istiara, iqtibas and some dialogical features. And I think in conclusion that it was impossible to understand the experimental threats of kalimat fil hub without a metrical and rhetorical analysis of it. If we pursue a European-centered and fully thematic perspective of inquiry, these threats would remain silent. I think so that a cultural embedded cross-temporal approach is essential for in-depth analysis of both path and contemporary Arabic literary texts. And this very kind of approach put us in front of some in-depth inquiries on the ontological status of Arabic imagination. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
We can take 2 questions maximum.
This Hari Gushayb, I think this is not iktibas, this is talmih. Because iktibas is direct quotation from the Quran, but this is reminiscence. Reminiscence اشتعل رأس شيبا. So just this one, but your presentation was very good. I enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just pay attention. This is talmih.
You mean Tauria? Tauria in Arabic?
Hari Gushayb, it is not iktibas. Iktibas is direct quotation. If the poet uses the word اشتعل رأس شيبا, it would be iktibas. But this is talmih. This is reminiscence.
Okay. Thank you, Chu. Thank you, Chu. I will check on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. You spoke about micro-study. And you said that you are going to work on whole the text. I had the same problem when I used Giorgiani's idea, and I think the Arabic tradition theory has this problem. You know, all the study is micro study. You know, they work on. It's not more than they don't go beyond a verse. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's always a problem. And but when in practice, when you were explaining your findings, I find that you also studied not more than a verse. I don't know. Maybe you are going to continue and you expand in stylistic mode. You know, you look at whole text, but in this part, I found that your studies.
Yeah, this is only an extract from my PhD thesis dissertation, in which I wrote 600 pages on Najib Surur's production, in which I have explored and I've pursued this metrical and rhetorical analysis for the most important lyrical and dramatic production. And yeah, I've taken some relevant and general considerations of the text, but in order to explain how we could employ and pay attention to every single figure of speech, and which are also the difficulties that we face in this process. Here in this small intervention, I try to sum up and to quote some exemplary sketches. And I perfectly agree with you about Giorgiani's model, but I also agree with the pragmatics studies on Giorgiani's model, which really brought the perspective, I think, on Al-Giorgiani in a real interesting way, such as Garcetti, Mutawakkil, Fassi Fehri. They say that this is a model, and of course, Giorgiani don't deserve to employ so long examples. You could also explain the model through small examples.
Yes.
And this is, for example, occurs when he would like to stress a sort of binary communication among the speaker and his interlocutor, when he stressed for several pages the term why we use in, for example.
Yes.
So only really small example. But the pragmatic pragmatics-inspired reading of Al-Giorgiani, I think that well dignified the exemplarity of this process.
Yes, but in some parts, suppose Tajnis.
Sorry?
I think Tajnis or Jenas.
Could you?
Oh yes, about Jenas. I think it's impossible to go beyond the verse because I'm not sure that I'm right, but when you think about whole the text, because you have to listen the word and the other words that they have similarities in letters or vowels, short vowels even. But when you go beyond the verse and you think about whole the poetry, I think you cannot judge about Jenas. I think the scale of Jenas is, is short. You cannot. Maybe we need to divide some, some devices that we can judge in whole the text. For example, about syntactic structures, yes, I think we can, as Jakobsen have done. For example, repetitive structures in whole the poetry. And Giorgiani, yes, he just explained, and we can do it for whole the text. But about some devices, I think we cannot. It's impossible. Devices such as Jenas.
I disagree for a simple reason. That of course we have to well understand what kind of text we are dealing with. So, for example, when we observe quartets, as I did with Najib Surura or Rubaiyat Najib Surura, when you observe quartets, you have to make, and you could make, a rhetorical and metrical analysis only quartet by quartet.
Yes.
So, because sometimes you can have up to 23 variations of the same matter from a quartet to another quartet.
Yes.
So it's impossible to proceed with the same approach to the metrical or rhetorical analysis, because also quartets, for example, as a different realization and evolution in the Arabic literary tradition according to the occurrence of specific figures of speech. So we have, for example, Rubai Marduf, and up to four kinds of Rubai or Rubai, in which are marked by the specific occurrence of genus, for example, among the first and four hemistichs, and another type among the first and the second, and another one among the third and the fourth. So, when we have to take into account what is that kind of the composition that we are dealing with, and how we have to analyze it according to the employment of these structures. So here, for example, we have a composition in couplets that is really innovative by a metrical point of view, and I'm able to observe the occurrences of figures of speech couplet by couplet, because despite it's written in couplets, is a single verse structure. So if I understand very well what is the kind of composition, and we call the also contemporary poetry, which is inspired by ancient models as Rubayat Najib Surur or Rubayat Salajahin, which are written in Lahja, for example. But if we know how is composed this very kind of text, we could make, because we have all the instruments, but of course we have a good managing of this instrument of critical tools.
May I interrupt? We are running out of time. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Leila. We should turn to our final speaker because time is up. Claire is going to present her paper entitled Telemachus in Egypt. Yep.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience and bearing with me for like 20 more minutes. Thank you for bearing with me 20 more minutes. I'm going to have to ask you to be double patient because I'm not a specialist of poetics and I'm sick. So I hope you enjoy. So we have been asked to present ourselves and our work, so I'm going to do that first. My research interrogates through comparative literature theory and translation studies the relationship to the other and the failure of an encounter between France and the Arab world in the 19th century. By adopting a global scope and choosing literary translations made in the 19th century from French into Arabic and from Arabic into French as its field of study, my work resynchronizes two momentums often studied separately, as completely independent and hermetic, the Nahda and the century of the French Orientalism, participating to the reevaluation and rebalancing of intellectual and literary relationships or non-relations between Europe and the Middle East. It offers a panorama of literary translations published in the 19th century in the form of an experimental interactive diagram online and open source. I mean, it will be open source, to be used as a database for researchers willing to engage with these kind of questions. I would love to show it to you, but I think we're really running out of time, so I'm going to cut to the chase. It redefines boundaries between translation, imitation, adaptation, and rewriting concepts by recontextualizing the use of words in the 19th century's publication and revisiting the evaluative approach of translation. Ultimately, the thesis engages with different theoretical concepts, such as Antoine Berman's Horizons of Expectations, Ihya, Iqtibas, translational anachronism, eroticization, and it conceptualized, because they're mine, what I have called introduction in French, which means introduction slash translation, but the play on words just works in French, so it's untranslatable. Transgeneric translation, auto-exoticism, and performative translation, amongst others. My work relies more particularly upon the study of two cases. Tahtawi's translation of Fénelon, Les Aventures de Télémaque, in the light of several other Arabic translations of the Telemachus undertaken in the 19th century, on the one hand, and on which I will present my paper today, and the anonymous French translation of the Perfume Garden, the erotic treatise by Nafzawi, facing the imposture translations of the same text by Antonin Terme in French and Richard Burton in English. And I am now in my personal journey towards the progressive displacement of the Gravity Center of Comparative Literature and Translation Studies, working on a project with Marilyn Booth on circulation and translation of text in the 19th century Middle East, in which I have the chance to work and collaboratively write together with different scholars working on Persian, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Urdu, etc., etc. And I'm really happy that I'm here today and I could listen to so many scholars working on those different languages, and maybe we can develop some projects together later at dinner. So my curriculum in both comparative literature and global literary theory, as well as Arabic studies, led me to the question of the place of non-European literatures in literary theory. Comparative poetics, comparative literature, translational studies, world literature, and I'm really honored to be able to be here today to take a step further in displacing the gravity center from the dominating quattro English, French, German, and Italian in Europe universities, or English written literature when it comes to English and American universities. So thank you, Hani, and thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me. And thank you, Rania, for doing all this. As the exploration of comparative poetics is still new for me, I am even more grateful to Hani and Rebecca. But it felt more appropriate, instead of coming up with a new topic, to present a text I already know well, and as part of the post-Eurocentric work I have been trying to do on Nahda literary text. I guess it can sound a bit provocative to propose the study of a translation from French as a post-Eurocentric analysis, but hopefully I will convince you. I am very fond of paradoxes, and it seemed even more interesting to me, especially since I have the chance to conclude this fantastic day. And we can open to translation studies. And it kind of buckled up with what has been, what was the opening, not the opening because that was you, but the first paper on translating in its own style, you'll see. So to explore Tahtawi literary piece, Ma waqia al-aflaq fi waqa'i Telemaque. So this is the book. I took it with me. See how happy I was to come? I carried this with me from London. I suggest to read this text, presented as a translation of Les Aventures de Télémaque by Fénelon, as a work aimed to renew with the Arabic traditions of Rihla and Mirror for Princes, if not a manifesto for Arabic poetics. If mostly literary critics and historians have seen in the 19th century Arabic translations produced in Egypt and Bilad Hashem, the so-called or so described passive copying from Europe at his height, the quintessence of iqtibas, borrowing, the Telemaque by Tahtawi offers, through the exercise of translation as a means for, on the one hand, a personal revenge against his sovereign, we'll talk about it later, and on the other hand, as an exercice de style, to revive classical Arabic genre, so to produce ihya, participate to the foundation of modern Arabic language, and set a keystone of modern Arabic literature. Engaging with post-European, sorry, I can't even say it anymore. Engaging with post-Eurocentric poetics, I argue that in this case study, iqtibas is a mere matrix for ihya, and tarjama is its tool. By Arabizing, transposing, and putting into saja, Les Aventures de Télémaque, recognized for its language qualities and eloquence, used and translated all over Europe and beyond in the 18th century onwards to teach French, Tahtawi acts on the modernization of Arabic. Focusing, for example, on the chapter 2 and 3 of the journey in Egypt and Bilad Hashem, we experiment how what was presented in the 17th century French original as an anecdotic episode in a utopia, in an exotic faraway land, is taken to the next level of recognition in the Arabic version, creating, through the time continuum, because it's in the same geographical space, identification, and guides the reader towards a feeling of nostalgia of golden ages and political reflections. Willing to look at the translational choices not as an error or a misunderstanding, as translation studies have had the tendency to do so since their creation, I propose to interpret them within the context of Tahtawi's political, literary, and religious, if you read the Tageldin, last Tageldin article, project. An essentially Arabic, if not Egyptian, performance of what could be read as a French example of Balagha. Because Well, we will get back to that. So, contresens, faux sens, bel infidèle, Tahrib al-Tilimak as a passive original mistake or as an active rewriting. Translations and their achievement are often looked at in terms of accuracy in relation to their original. I suggest we look at this literary translation into a language within the poetics in which this language has been developing. Is in its own style, in terms of form and style. Let's have a look at how the. First, I want to give you a bit of the genesis of the French book and the Arabic book, because the political context is very interesting, and we could see it as a original contresens or faux sens in the project of the translator. So I'm going to tell you. Let's have a look at how the intention and project of the original author can be understood, assimilated, and redirected by the translator. More than the original unfaithfulness inherent to translation, more than a fault of interpretation, we assist with Tahtawi's translation to a reappropriation and reorientation of the purpose of the original text itself towards a renewing with traditional Arabic poetics. The original novel, between journey account and Mirror from Princes, presenting a typology of kings and their hybris, and accusing intriguers and sycophants, and we will see in a minute, is a perfect mirror for Tahtawi's anger and inner feelings when he decided to start the Arabization of the Telemaque, was never meant to be an attack and criticize Fénelon sovereign, who was Louis XIV. So a brief history. So when Fénelon composed his Télémaque, he wrote it for the education of his student, the Dauphin, the Duc de Bourgogne, and was in the graces of the King Louis XIV. A few years later, so he was very happy in the court and very welcome in the court. A few years later, a religious dispute led him to be exiled, and this is when the book was published. And according to the accounts, and according to Fénelon himself, the book was published without him knowing by one of his disciples. And the book has been read by one of his rivals to the king as a harsh critic of absolute monarchy and the system of the court, with courtiers, slanderers, etc. And even by later historians and critics as in an anachronological way, as the reason for his exile. But as I said, the book was written for the education of the prince when Fénelon was the preceptor of the prince. It was never meant to be published, according to him, and he was exiled for another reason before the book was even published. So it couldn't have been the reason for his exile. And it was not a revenge either against Louis XIV, because he had already written the book. Yet the translator, as several European readers, found in it a pamphlet against absolute monarchy and tyranny, and with it the possibility to destabilize 2 centuries after the French publication his own sovereign, Abbas Pasha. It is when both, so I'm going to explain how Tahtawi did his translation. So it is when both offended by Abbas Pasha I, who just ostracized him to Sudan, and also bored away from Egypt, that Tahtawi composes in his leisure hours the act of translating Fénelon's edifying novel as a pamphlet against the tyrant. Indeed, when Abbas comes to power after Mehmed Ali was deposed and the death of Ibrahim Pasha in 1849, he sends Tahtawi to Sudan. After he was advised by one of his courtiers, Tahtawi's rival, who interpreted the text and showed that in the Gold of Paris, that had just been reprinted, there was a harsh critique of the power and a challenge of the Egyptian political system. So you can see already the chiasma that is happening there between the two Genesis. Gamal al-Din al-Shayal confirms that this is during his years in Sudan that Tahtawi writes what will become a much more obvious critique of power and tyranny and a pamphlet against Abbas Pasha and court vices than the Gold of Paris ever was. But do we have to? So I really like this story about how those two Genesis are so entangled and yet have nothing to do with each other. But even if Tahtawi took this book as a tool to write a pamphlet, do we have to think that he was making a contresens or a mistake from the original text? My answer is no, or better say, we shouldn't care. And start looking at the text for what it is. One of the cornerstones of modern Arabic literature, regardless of its French origin. It does not matter if the translated version takes its origin in a misinterpretation, a faux sens, a contresens. I like using the French words because it's a French book. It doesn't matter if it's a belle infidèle, like Mouna calls them. And here I'm, sorry, I said that already. Tahtawi's project is somewhere else, and the text to Egyptianize becomes a tool to achieve his own highly national, if not personal, projects. So I was saying earlier that we should look at the chapter 2 and 3. So the chapter 2 and 3 happen in Bilad al-Shem, Phoenicia, and Egypt, ancient Egypt. And I'm going to just focus on the Egyptian part. So the Egyptian chapter is very interesting and very important in the novel as well. But for Tahtawi, it's like a gift. It's on a silver plate because it presents a great, fair, well-read king, Sesostris, and mentor with Telemaque shows him how this is how a king should rule. But Sesostris dies, and his son, he's a brutal, stupid, violent, unfair king. And so for Tahtawi, it's exactly what's happening in Egypt for him, what he thinks is happening for him at the moment. So Sesostris would be the reflection of Mehmed Ali, and his son would be the reflection of Abbas Pasha the first. And so this episode of Telemachus and Mentor's journey to a faraway land gives to Tahtawi the possibility to come back home. And let's not forget the journey of Telemaque, as well as the Odyssea, is the account of a return. It's not just a journey, it's a return. So there's a symbolic here that is very interesting, I think. And on top of that, Telemaque's account is the account of the search of a father. And Tahtawi is trying to create affiliation with Arabic ancient literature, and we will come to that in a second. So in a lost, great, remote past, and recreates a continuum, a geographical filiation in the Mirror for Princes to bring to light the faults of a pasha he finds stupid and brutal. The evocation of the young and violent sovereign, as opposed to the greatness of his... It's been 10 minutes. Okay. His father, Sesostris, is. I think I will be fine. He served on the. Sorry, I said that. Well, I lost my sentence, but I got to jump. That is for the so-called original misinterpretation of the text, so the political aspect. Even more relevant to today's conference is how this supposedly translation, considered by critics as one of the first modern Arabic literature products by Roger Allen, Mati Moussa, they all talk about it, renewed and redesigned affiliation with traditional Arabic poetics in terms of genre, the rihla, the Mirror for Princes, and style, the saja. So, and becomes, in my opinion, what we could call a Nahdist literary manifesto or something. The text also allows us to reevaluate the usual distinction when it comes to study Arabic literature between Ihya, revival, and Iqtibas, borrowing. This text and other published as translations prove that both concepts are not separated, and that even when it comes to Iqtibas, borrowing from the West, it can reveal to be a mere matrix, as I said in my introduction, for Ihya, in which Tarjama is just a tool. In the context of a general attempt for modernization of Arabic language, as it is in the 19th century Egypt, translation is a well-known tool for experimentation of language. And this is maybe, I'm going to just have just a second here. I'm going to stop just a second here. This is what I wanted to talk about this morning when I was wondering how we can, entering the global theory walk on translating by reinventing terms or by finding them in different, I was mentioning the gender studies vocab, that we could, instead of trying to find equivalence and produce a language for literary theory that would actually correspond to the modernity of what is tried to be done here. So that's for the round table or the dinner, but I want to put this here. So here, not only does Tahtawi uses the French to play with Arabic in his, as he said, lost hours, but he manages to recreate a link with our Arabic tradition. He chooses to rewrite the French prose into Saja. So there's a poetization of the text, transposition of what is considered by, because the French by Fénelon was was considered by a lot of Arabic writers at the time as some kind of very close to Balaha or in the classics, and they found some fasaha and some badia. We can find it in other translation of the text by Ilyas ibn Faraj and Wassili Fakhir. They both talk about the text as something that they recognize the Arabic style somehow because of its beauty and its clarity. And this is something very important, that in a way, he goes back to this text because it's translating. It's about translating oneself and not the other. So renewing with renewing with an Arabic poetic tradition, a non-existing in the West style, the Saja, as an exercise of style in his moments when it doesn't work, translated in its own style. Because he's having fun doing it. He talks about it and he says, there's not a moment when I don't go back to it. So it's a pleasure. He's taking a lot of pleasure. Not only, it becomes beyond criticizing Abbas Pasha. It becomes really what I think is a manifesto for Arabic literature and language. So yeah, Tahtawi and his so as the expression, I'm sorry, we won't have time to go into the text, but what I wanted to say is, so you have the title here is already Sage, because the original title is Les Aventures de Télémaque, so Télémaque's Adventures, and the text is Ma voix est la flaque fi waka Télémaque, so the position of the stars and their relation to Telemachus' adventures, we could translate back into English. So we can see that there's Sage from the title. And it's not the only text, because I'm taking this as a case study. So, so the French text is like that big. That's the Arabic version, because that's what Sage does to a text, right? It doubles everything. And it's not because the paratext is big, because the paratext is just this. So it's really the facsimile of the text is enormous. And but we find other few examples of translations into Sage amongst the literary translation from French into Arabic, and it does not necessarily apply to classical French texts from the 17th century. This is my last comment. I'll finish on another example. So there's the 19th century Cinq Semaines en Ballon by Jules Verne. and it's translated as الرحلة الجوية في المركبة الهوائية. So the atmospheric journey in an inflatable vessel, we could say. That is a translation by Sarkis in Beirut in 1875. So the retranslation into their overinflated equivalent in English of such titles, and as I said, we do not have the time to go through the novels as they evolve, but it's a proof there that the entire text, but I mean, I know that it's all in Sage, but it shows that the text doesn't matter, and it's not about trying to translate in the right way. It's about producing a new form, because, of course, the atmospheric journey in an inflatable vessel is not a very, it's not a very pretty translation, and it doesn't correspond to the original at all. So here, the form and the genre are defining the choice on translation and not the other way around. And that's how I want to conclude. Thank you.
Okay, we have got 15 minutes for questions, comments.
So thank you so much when I first looked at our panel, I was like, we have two medieval, I was like, Hani. But actually we're kind of thinking of similar questions. I mean, Ibn Rushd is always like kind of held back, and we need to look at his work through Aristotle and not think of it the other way around. For me, Al-Andalus is I always have to say Al-Andalus, yes, it borrows and subscribes to Arabo-Islamic cultural consensus, but it's unique. And so it was really interesting that with you it's translation and iqtibas, and we're still at a stage where we have to say that reproducing knowledge and reuse to new audiences is is an act of interpretation. It's it's as creative, and this question of the original. So I really thought that was a very interesting. We all kind of have similar questions.
Yeah, I actually thought the same. I was thinking the same when Chiara was talking. It was that we're all walking on some kind of spaces where there's an encounter between two other cultures or languages, and it was actually a good a well-related panel. Thank you.
Thanks.
No, sorry. We'll see.
This is about, so I know that I'm quite familiar with the late Ottoman translations of the French novels, and you should be aware there's someone named Etienne Charrière at Bilkent University in Ankara. He works on, he works on Armenian translations and Greek and Ladino. So I'm curious, so the only Arabic translation I actually have looked at is the translation of Robinson Crusoe, because that was one of the three most popular novels, and it came through Arabic through Turkish. Now, I'm curious, in the introduction to Telemak translation by Tatawi, and he comes a little bit before the big flourishing of the novel from the 1860 onwards in the broader Ottoman context, or is it earlier? I'm curious.
Yes, he did it. He started the translation in 1849.
Right, that's what I thought.
But he was published later, way later, in the 1860s.
So I'm curious, so I know that, so the best example of how at least the Turkish novelists thought of these novels, or roman, is the introduction to the translation of Count of Monte Cristo by Ahmed Mithat Effendi that calls it a nazira, right, as a way to address, it goes back to things that Feli's interested in about how to talk, it's not terjemah in the proper sense, right? And it's dealing with using a poetic form to make something familiar to an audience, but using it in a slightly different way. Does Tatawi address any of those issues in the introduction instead of going through, like, I mean, I don't disagree with what Roger Allen says, but I'm just curious if he actually addresses in the introduction about, because it is a new kind of narrative, right? And you know as well as all these sort of adventure narratives that become quite popular in both Turkish and Arabic, and to a lesser, we can even say Persian to a certain extent in this period. So I'm just curious, does he address that at all? Because it is a weird story to tell to an audience that's not familiar at that early stage. Thanks.
So the question is, what do you want to know? What
introduction is a way.
What he should address? I didn't.
No,
sorry.
because it's a new kind of narrative which they don't have a term for. So I'm just curious, does he address it in the introduction, which at least I know the Turkish writers try to do. So.
No. He refers to it as a rihla. So that's what is interesting as well, because yes, it is a new form, but at the same time he makes it a continuum to something that is already pre-existing in the Arab world. It's different for, I mean, also it was published first in a journal. Yes, exactly, but yeah, it's something I haven't said, so, but yeah. So some do, like the translations of Jules Verne usually talk about the modernity and everything, but it's also because of the theme of Jules Verne's books.
Hi, thank you for this, and you know, I'm glad Shadin Taguddin's work is gaining this kind of traction, that it's giving place to even more Egyptocentrism, I would have to say. Which is very fascinating, of course, right? You know, we are, I'm not sure if you are stepping out of the frame of Eurocentrism at all, and this is a very long discussion, I think, but even if you are, by insisting so much, while ignoring even things you know, on this kind of psychological and nationalistic narrative of Tahtawi's translation, you are ignoring not only these, you know, Ladino, Bulgarian, Greek, Armenian translations of the same work that operate in very similar logics, but also ignoring, for example, the simple fact that already in 1819, an Arabic translation of Fenelon's Telemaque is published by an author that you have mentioned, Ilyas ibn Faraj ibn Dahir al-Halabi. And it's published, guess what? Constantinople.
Well, I am not ignorant of that. I know that.
No, I mean that is precisely the problem, though. You know, by completely shunting aside the larger political context of this translation of a book that was read and translated by all sorts of Ottomans as a deeply political book already decades before Tahtawi, and focusing instead his presumably interior thought process, to me seems to be very impoverishing.
So I'm sorry you think that I don't know that, or I don't work on other translations.
You mentioned yourself, you know very well.
Can I just answer? So my purpose today was to talk about this precise translation and not another one, not to compare with another one. I do think that the project of Tahtawi was different from other projects by other authors. It's the only fictional text except La Belle Hélène that Tahtawi, and it wasn't him, he was just directing the translation for La Belle Hélène. This is the only fictional text that Tahtawi translated. So his interest for the text, I think, was what mattered to me, not the fact that A Mirror for Princes, that is Telemaque, is important before Tahtawi starts the translation. I think Tahtawi does the translation in a purpose, which is, as I said, a literary manifesto, because other translations of the Telemaque are not in Saja. Georges Shahin retranslates after Tahtawi, and he says that his translation is better because it's closer to the original, but what he does is actually, he doesn't even go back to the French, and I have proof of that. He just erases all the things that Tahtawi added. And even beyond that, Finland was translated all over Europe from the 17th century, 18th century, to teach French, as I said at the beginning. So Finland this text was very important everywhere in terms of language, even more than in terms of politics, I think. And I think it was also used, it was also translated in Arabic because it was translated everywhere, and it was a text that everybody knew, and it was something. There are also examples of translations of the text that have never been published into Arabic, but they were started or finished even, but never were published. There were, we count like 25, I think, in the same period of Arabic versions. So yeah, I'm sorry if it sounded that I was pretending that this doesn't exist. I was just trying to focus on this one.
I think you ignored the question completely. That's okay.
Thank you.